Since I'm backstage, I'm going to tell you when they're going to come on stage, okay?
I can get you a headset if you want.
That would be good.
Yes, that would be good. Well, now we're getting ready to start.
Okay, we're live. Okay, so you're ready?
Are you ready? Everybody ready? Okay. All right. Yeah.
Welcome, everyone, to the National Museum of the American Indian. My name is Michelle Delaney. I am the Associate Director for Museum Research and Scholarship, and I am also the person to welcome you to our full day of service and sacrifice commemorating Memorial Day 2025. Today we have a real treat for you. We will be seeing a presentation called Grace Thorpe, A Life of Service. Rachel Menyuk has been a processing archivist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian since 2010. She has processed large organizational records, such as the National Congress of the American Indian records, in addition to personal collections like the Grace Thorpe and Shan Gashorn collections. Recent projects include reassembling and recontextualizing over 300 photographic and audiovisual legacy collections, as well as helping to lead the effort to update the NMAI's cultural thesaurus and access to archival collections, both online and in person. Rachel received her BA in anthropology and theater from the University of Maryland and her MA in humanities and social thought from the New York University. Rachel is prepared to give a wonderful presentation today. For courtesy, please make sure that your cell phones are on silent and enjoy your rest of the day here at the NMAI. Rachel?
Good morning, and thank you to everyone for joining us at this Memorial Day event. I'd like to start out by thanking the organizers of the event, Rochelle Pablo in particular, and Michelle Delaney for the introduction. It's an honor to be asked to speak here today, and I'm very excited to share the work of the National Museum of the American Indian Archive Center, along with the story of the amazing woman you're going to be hearing about, Grace Thorpe. My name is Rachel Menyuk, and I have worked as an archivist at the National Museum of the American Indian for what will be 15 years this summer. And I get asked a lot, what does an archivist actually do? I think when people imagine archivists, they imagine us sitting down in a windowless basement surrounded by dusty boxes. Now, I will admit, we do sometimes have to go through dusty boxes, but really, archivists have the privilege of exploring the bits and pieces that, when put together, tell the stories of people's lives. Oh, did not expect that sound, but it really added to the ambiance of the moment. Archives are dynamic. Archives are places of discovery. And at the NMAI Archive Center, archives serve as a platform for historical and contemporary Native and Indigenous stories to be told, and for Native and Indigenous voices to be heard telling those stories. As part of the NMAI collections, the Archive Center supports the mission of the museum by focusing on materials around Native art, knowledge, events, social and political movements, as well as Native veterans' experiences. One of the biggest differences between archives and three-dimensional objects like baskets or pottery is in how we steward and manage them. In collections, each item receives its own catalog number, one item to one number. In archives, we deal in groups of materials. Photographs, documents, and audiovisual materials are described together in one larger collection. These materials often provide the context to a person's life and work, and when viewed together, can tell a fuller and richer story. As a processing archivist, my job is to organize all the materials that tell these stories. At the NMAI Archive Center, these items include over 500,000 photographs, over 1,500 feet of paper materials, and now this is a little out of date, over 8,000 time-based or audio-visual materials. So these can include negatives, prints, lantern slides, papers, diaries, journals, sketchbooks, film, video, audio, all of those amazing things. Archivists take those letters, journals, photo albums, and maybe even mixtapes, preserve them appropriately, describe them in what we call a finding aid or collection guide, so that community members and researchers can find what they are looking for. And finally, we put the collections online for access. Archives are collaborative. I work with an incredible team of archivists at the Cultural Resources Center in Suitland, Maryland, and I'm going to give them a shout out now. Emily Mozami is our head archivist, Nathan Sowery, our reference archivist, Maddie Lewis, our archives technician, and Jeremy Gardner, our digitization specialist. And we work very closely together to make all of our work happen. Beyond working together behind the scenes at the Cultural Resources Center, the most important and rewarding collaborations that happen are with community and family members represented in the collections we steward. We showcase this work in NMAI's newest exhibition, curated by Emily, Nathan, and myself on the second floor in the Sealaska Gallery. In sight, photos and stories from the archives gives an intimate view of Indigenous lives across the Western Hemisphere and across time. The photographs in Insight, along with the stories behind them, refute stereotypes and misconceptions about Native people. We hope you'll take some time while you're at the museum today to go check it out on the second floor. And now, shifting gears just a little bit. In 2015, Grace Thorpe's daughter, Dr. Dagmar Seeley, and granddaughter, Tina Malott, chose the NMAI Archive Center as a home for Grace's archival collection. Over the course of her long and distinguished life, Grace Thorpe had meticulously gathered interviews, articles, and photographs relating to both her work and her father, Jim Thorpe's legacy. In 2017, I had the privilege of organizing and describing Grace's collection. And through that process, I got to know Grace through her own words, some of which I would like to share with you today. To start, a quick background on Grace's family. Grace's father, Jim Thorpe, has often been considered one of the most versatile athletes of modern sports. Jim was born in 1887, a member of the Sac and Fox Nation in Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma. Jim was sent to several Indian boarding schools in his early youth, including Haskell Indian Boarding School and Lawrence, Kansas. In 1904, Jim Thorpe began attending Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where he first met athletic coach Glenn "Pop" Warner. Jim Thorpe's athletic career began in earnest in 1907 when he beat all of Carlisle's school records in track and field and competed in football, baseball, lacrosse, boxing, handball, and ballroom dancing, which apparently he was very good at. In 1912, Jim competed in the Stockholm Summer Olympics, where he won 2 gold medals, one in classic pentathlon and the other in the decathlon. However, in 1913, it was reported that Jim Thorpe had played semi-professional baseball before the Olympics, which violated the International Olympic Committee's strict rules regarding amateurism. And the committee unanimously decided to strip Thorpe of his Olympic titles, medals, awards, and officially declared him a professional. Another very important 1912 event in the story of Grace Thorpe was the meeting of Jim Thorpe and Iva Miller. Iva Miller was a student at Carlisle in the 1912 graduating class. Like Jim and later Grace, Iva attended several different Indian boarding schools as a child following her mother's death. Iva was brought up believing that she was of Cherokee descent. However, Grace later wrote in her notes that after graduating Carlisle, Iva's brothers revealed to her that she was not actually Cherokee or native at all, and had only made that claim to be able to send Iva to school, which I thought was a very interesting tidbit myself. Jim and Iva met when Jim was captain of the football team at Carlisle, and following a courtship, they were married in October of 1913. After their wedding, they honeymooned around the world while Jim was playing with the New York Jets. Their first child, Jim Jr., was born in 1915, followed by Gail in 1917, James in 1918, Charlotte in 1919, and finally, Grace Frances Thorpe was born in 1921 in Yale, Oklahoma. Unfortunately, the marriage did not last, and Jim and Iva divorced in 1925, and their children were all placed in Indian boarding schools starting in 1927. Both Jim and Iva remarried, and Grace moved between her parents' homes in Chicago and California when not at school, maintaining close relationships with both. Grace was only 6 years old when she was first enrolled at Haskell Indian Boarding School, which her father had also attended as a young boy. Grace writes about one of her earliest memories of her father when she was 6. Haskell was dedicating a new football stadium, and her dad was the featured guest, and I quote, "I can still hear the noise from the crowd. They went crazy. I wasn't impressed. I remember asking if my daddy was finished because he had promised to take me to town for ice cream and candy, and I wanted him to come right now," end quote. And if anyone has children, they know that they still ask these things. Here you can see a photo of Grace at Haskell and a report card from the 2nd grade that are in her archives. And she got very good grades, I think. Reading 90, spelling 95, so pretty good. Grace would send letters and artwork to her mother during her school years, many of which made their way back to Grace later in life and are now part of her archives. They paint just a small picture of what her life was like as a child during this time. The letter on the left was written to her mother on March 30th, 1929, when Grace was not quite 8 years old. She writes, quote, "Charlotte is very sick. April Fool, Mother. There's a bug on top of your head. April Fool for this year. I'm going to run away tomorrow. April Fool for the year." And, of course, XOXOXOXOXO, XOXOXOXOXOX. Grace attended Chillicothe Indian Agricultural School in the 1930s and maintained a good relationship with both her mother and father during those years. I wanted to point out that one of our favorite things as archivists is when photographs are dated. And you can see that the dates were actually printed on the front of these. If you can't, it says April 1935, August 1935, April 1936 on the actual front of the photograph. And I'll add my necessary plug as an archivist to please date and label your own family photographs. It really helps us out down the line. Though we have a slight gap between the 1930s and early 1940s in the records, which often happens in archival collections, we know that sometime in 1943, Grace began working for the Ford Motor Company on the final assembly line in the aircraft building to support the war effort. And on May 1st, Grace enlisted in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, later renamed the Women's Army Corps, or WACS. The picture on the right is a clipping with Grace, her father Jim, and her 2 sisters, Charlotte and Gail. These here are Grace's official photographs, which were taken when she entered WAC training in 1943. You'll see this as a theme, particularly in her younger years, but even in her later years. Grace was always seen as Jim Thorpe's daughter, no matter where she went, and she was often asked to pose with a football. like this photo right here. Women played a critical role in the Allied victory of World War II. Around 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps, and 50,000 trained at Chickamauga Battlefield, which was home to the 3rd WAC Training Center in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. Grace graduated from recruiting school at Fort Oglethorpe in July of 1943. And someone very nicely placed this little green dot to show you exactly where Grace Thorpe is in this photo. On the back of this photograph, Grace listed out all the other women who were part of her graduating class, and it includes notes from some of them like, "Lots and lots of luck, Thorpe, leave a few recruits for the rest of us." Following graduation, Grace went to work in the WAC recruiting offices in Tucson, Arizona. These photographs here were taken on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1943, at a parade in Tucson. This event was an observation of the 25th anniversary of the signing of the armistice that ended World War I. Now deeply engaged in World War II, President Roosevelt had issued a proclamation urging Americans to rededicate themselves to the war effort. The back of this photograph says, "Join the WACs." Army trucks pick up civilian women and took them to Davis-Monthan, an Air Force base, for the day. And I will say that reading this handwriting is not always the easiest thing to do. In 1944, Grace was sent to work at the WAC recruiting offices in Butte, Montana, and later to Camp White, Oregon. These photographs from May of 1944 show both WACs at work and play. The caption on the back of the top right photo reads, "River seen with the WACs, disrupting its scenic beauty." At the end of the summer of 1944, Grace, along with other WACs, were sent overseas to the Pacific Theater and stationed in New Guinea, now Papua New Guinea. I like to showcase this letter from Grace to her mother and stepfather for 2 reasons. The first is that I think it's a great example of Grace's humor. She writes on February 16th, 1945, "Dear Mother and D. Harry," short for Daddy Harry, "still in New Guinea and still wondering how long I will remain. Naturally, being women, we all have our prophecies of when we will go. But perhaps the censor hasn't heard what I have, and who am I to tell him?" The second reason I like to show this letter is that it wasn't originally part of the collection. In 2022, the Archive Center was contacted by a gentleman who wanted to know if we would be interested in acquiring this letter. His daughter had found it in the garage of a former antique store owner. The airmail envelope addressed from New Guinea had caught her eye because her father had used to live there. Their family was so intrigued by Grace's letter, they started to do research on her. A search for Grace Thorpe and WAC turned up immediate results from the NMAI Archives website with her bio and allowed them to contact us directly about donating it, which they did, and now it is a part of Grace Thorpe's collection. I also wanted to point out that at the top left corner, Grace writes, "I am sending some pictures in another envelope." Some of those pictures, those photographs, ended up in an album documenting Grace's experience stationed in Finschhafen, one of the largest bases in the Southwest Pacific area, and Oro Bay Airfield, both in New Guinea, from August of 1944 to September of 1945. She was later awarded the Bronze Star for her service in the Battle of New Guinea. In September of 1945, Grace was sent to Manila in the Philippines to be present at the surrender of the Japanese and Japanese-controlled forces in the Philippine Islands to the United States Armed Forces before being sent on to Japan And here there's actually a copy that she had of the instrument of surrender of the Japanese forces. On the right, you can see photographs Grace took in Manila, along with a photo of Grace herself holding a twin lens reflex camera. And I just love this photo of Grace with the camera. There's nothing that archivists love more than photos of photographers holding their cameras. Following her honorable discharge in 1945, Grace chose to stay in Tokyo, Japan, to work as chief of the recruitment section for the Department of Civilians at General MacArthur's headquarters. Part of Grace's reason for staying in Japan was her relationship with Lieutenant Fred Seeley. Grace and Fred had met several years prior when stationed in New Guinea and had written in her letter home to her mother, quote, "Fred is a wonderful person, and I think I really love him. He has been reassigned to his old outfit, the 11th Airborne. The paratroopers are a suicide outfit, and if he comes through, I am thinking of marrying him," end quote. Grace and Fred were married on June 27th, 1946. And these are photos from their reception in Tokyo. It was during her years in Japan that Grace really blossomed as a photographer. Of all the periods in her life, this is the time we have the most photos taken by Grace, many of which were carefully and deliberately put into photo albums like the one you see here on the right. These photos document her day-to-day life, trips across Japan, events with friends, and of course, the birth of her children. Her daughter Dagmar was born in late 1946, and Paul Thorpe, Paul, quote, his nickname was Thorpe, was born in 1948, both in Japan. And I'll let you take a second to look at these cute pictures, because they're very cute. In 1950, Fred and Grace divorced, and Grace chose to return to the United States with the children and settled in Pearl River, New York, near where her father was living at the time. This is their ship back to America. The family lived in Pearl River from 1950 to the mid-1960s, and it was during this time that Grace honed her skills as a businesswoman and salesperson. Grace was employed as a hostess with Welcome Wagon in July of 1951, and later became a supervisor and territorial account executive for the Yellow Pages. She also continued her work in the field of public relations, often leveraging her role as famous Jim Thorpe's daughter, as you can see here when she worked as a Goodyear ambassador. Sadly, Grace's life was upended following the tragic death of her son, Paul Thorpe, in 1964. This is a letter she wrote to her mother speaking of the event. Always close with her daughter Dagmar, the two both ended up in Arizona following Dagmar's graduation from high school, and Grace turned her prodigious business and public relations skills to Indian country. You'll see throughout her collection that Grace was continuously learning, growing, and taking classes, such as this one at the University of Arizona, to make a greater impact in her field. In 1968, Grace was hired by the National Congress of the American Indians as the Economic Development Conference Coordinator. Founded in 1944, the National Congress of American Indians, or NCAI, is the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native organization serving the broad interests of tribal governments and communities. Just as a side note, the records of the NCAI are also part of the NMAI Archive Center collections and are one of the most heavily used and researched collections in the archives. In March of 1969, Grace coordinated the Miss Indian Arizona pageant. And I just love this photo. You can see Grace smiling in the back row on the left, and you'll notice she's almost always the tallest person in the photos, standing at 6 feet. It was the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes that served as the push onto the path of activism that Grace continued walking for the rest of her life. In an interview on Radio Free Alcatraz, Grace said, "It, being Alcatraz, made me put my furniture into storage and spend my life savings." Grace spent 3 months living on Alcatraz Island from January to March of 1970, running public relations for the occupiers and serving as a link to the mainland. For Grace, the occupation of Alcatraz was just the start of her involvement in what she referred to as an Indian Renaissance. Grace was able to use both her famous name and powerful stature at multiple surplus land movement actions throughout 1970. This included the occupation of Fort Lawton in Washington State and the PG&E camp occupation in Northern California by the Pitt River Indian tribe. Other activists present at the Pitt River occupation recalled Thorpe saying, "I stand over 6 feet tall, and it's going to take 8 of you to move me." And it did. There's also another story that talks about needing a 9th person to carry her purse out too. These actions, the occupations of Alcatraz, Fort Lawton, and the PG&E camp were all part of a larger movement around surplus land use. For Grace, the work was not just political, but moral. One of the most successful campaigns to come out of the surplus land movement was the establishment of DQ University in 1971. What had been an abandoned Army base in Davis, California, was eventually turned into a joint college founded by and for Native American and Chicano students. Grace was a member of the founding board of directors, which included 16 Native American members and 16 Chicano members. In an interview from the time, Grace emphasized the fact that DQU shows we can do something for ourselves entirely by ourselves. This photograph here includes the original Native members of the DQU board in 1971, and all of their names are listed with the photo, just not right here. In 1972, Grace shifted her focus east to Washington, D.C., coordinating the National Congress of American Indians benefit, and then serving as a legislative assistant to Senator James Abourezk on the American Indian Policy Review Commission in 1975. And on the right, here you can see Grace shaking hands with President Gerald Ford at the White House in 1976. In the 1980s, Grace, and I'm putting this in quotes, retired to pursue other projects. One such project was working with some of her other siblings and family members to reinstate her father Jim Thorpe's Olympic record, which was accomplished in 1982. Together with her sister Gail, Grace continued her education, taking pottery classes and earning a bachelor's degree in American Indian law at the University of Tennessee. She also worked part-time as a tribal court judge and health commissioner for the Sac and Fox tribe. I'll remind you, this was her quote-unquote retirement. I would also like to emphasize how important family was to Grace, and this is evident by the many photos in her collection that include images of her siblings, children, and other family members. This photo, in particular, of Grace and her sister Gail, which is also in the Insight exhibition on the second floor, is one that reminds me how important family connections are and can be. Thorpe's idyllic retirement plans were thrown out the window in 1992 when she learned about Native American tribal governments, including the Sac and Fox Nation, applying for grants to store nuclear waste on tribal lands. Having witnessed firsthand the after effects of radiation in Japan following World War II, Grace couldn't stay silent. At the age of 75, Grace added environmental activist to her resume and formed the National Environmental Coalition of Native Americans to fight nuclear dumping on tribal lands. By the close of the 20th century, Grace had spent 30 years fighting for Native rights, earning herself numerous awards and honors along the way. When she passed in 2008, Grace was recognized and honored as a tribal elder, a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, and a fierce defender of her people. In 2015, Grace's daughter, Dr. Dagmar Seeley, and granddaughter, Tina Malott, donated Grace's large collection of photographs and papers documenting her extraordinary life to the National Museum of the American Indian Archives Center. The collection in its entirety can be viewed online through the Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives, or sova.si.edu. Yeah. All the photographs and documents you saw here today during this presentation, along with many, many more, are searchable through this platform. Along with many other collections in the Archive Center that showcase and represent Indigenous military experiences, such as Master Sergeant Chuck Bower's Iraq powwow photographs that shows an intertribal powwow held in Iraq in September of 2004 by the U.S. Army's 120th Engineer Combat Battalion. And this is one of our first digital photo collections that the Archive Center accessioned and has processed. Finally, I wanted to show you this short clip from a Pawnee Memorial Day powwow in Pawnee, Oklahoma from the 1950s. This is part of a larger film made by amateur filmmaker Arthur Hines for his film Of God and Country. We are just now at the Archive Center in the midst of a large project to get our audiovisual collections digitized and available online. And this film is one we have only recently put on our online platform. So please enjoy.
Sung by the Pawnees whenever our flag is raised or lowered. For many people here, this is a day of mourning for a brother or son lost in the war. Many Indian songs and dances are forms of prayer, and this is one of them.
So thank you very much, and I will add that the full film is now available online for viewing through that platform I showed you, Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives. And in that film, and I know this will be of interest to some in the audience, there are clips of Maria Tallchief dancing with the New York City Ballet, which is one of my favorite parts of that film. So again, thank you so much to the organizers for having me here today, and for all of you for being here and listening to this presentation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was incredible, and I hope that you will all join us back here at 1 o'clock when Alan Ho, a wonderful trustee of the NMAI and veteran himself, will be talking for his presentation. So thank you again, and see you back here at 1.